Korsakoff Syndrome, Victoria Friar, College of Coastal Georgia. Korsakoff Syndrome, this is a brain disorder. It's most commonly found in alcoholics, particularly heavy drinkers, as the alcohol destroys chemical in the brain needed. It's not only found in alcoholics, but that is the most common subgroup. It can be found in people with AIDS or cancers that have spread throughout the body. Ones that end up in the brain, people can end up with Korsakoff syndrome. Chronic infections can cause it, and malnutrition, which again, it leads to a decrease in chemicals, which in decrease in how the brain works effectively. They don't know the exact parameters like age or anything yet. They're still figuring that out because Korsakoff syndrome is a relatively new diagnosis. It was misdiagnosed as other things for so long that they're still kind of working on how to do it, but they do know the most common people who get it are heavy drinkers. The causes of Korsakoff syndrome, though, like I said, malnutrition can cause it. Malnutrition can cause it because of the levels, but the main thing that causes it, both heavy drinking and malnutrition, cause a decrease in levels of thiamine, which is a chemical in the brain that helps the brain turn sugar into energy. Well, if that thiamine is decreased, the brain isn't working fast enough. It isn't turning sugar into energy as effectively as it needs to be. And when it can't create or generate enough energy to function, the brain doesn't function at a normal level. It doesn't have the resources to. So that is what happens with Korsakoff syndrome, because the thiamine is just, there's not enough of it to do its job effectively. Symptoms of the Korsakoff syndrome include impaired memory. Probably one of the biggest there is impaired memory, both short and long-term memory. So it affects a wide variety of the areas of memory. You also end up with increased clumsiness and balance issues, because that is also controlled by the brain, and that is an area that the Korsakoff syndrome tends to target. You also have some involuntary movement, specifically involuntary eye movement. Twitching and all of that will increase with Korsakoff syndrome. Because of the issues with memory, a lot of the patients also have trouble learning new information because their short-term memory is damaged. They have trouble learning a new skill and retaining that information. They also, patients, because they have long-term problems, they have gaps in their memory where they just don't remember what happened for long periods. And a characteristic of Korsakoff syndrome is they will try to fill those with made-up memories. A lot of times the patients don't realize that these are made up. Their imagination creates them to fill those gaps. And so they actually remember the fake memories. This is something that they are increasing testing with this syndrome, is to figure out how to differentiate and how to help the patient differentiate, and all of that into like the further research and treatment of Korsakoff syndrome. But that is something that's fairly common. Memory effects. Like I said, the episodic memory is severely affected, which episodic memory is part of our long-term memory that helps us remember things that have happened to us, events in our life. So those are where you find the gaps that patients end up trying to fill with their memory. And so that is a big part of who we are. And so it's very hard for patients to lose part of that. Some researchers who've been looking into the syndrome have found that some of the patients do have issues with the initial encoding process. So it goes a little even more than just short-term memory. They have trouble with, their brain has trouble taking the information and processing it to store. So there's not even like short-term, like there's no real storage with it. And so they just can't retain anything off the bat. But that's not all patients, but that is something that they have found with Korsakoff syndrome. Scientists are working to design tests to evaluate memories that have affected the long-term, the memory pieces that patients have fit into their gaps created in the episodic memory. They're working on experiments to figure out how to differentiate between actual memories and these ones created when the patient believes that the created ones are actual memories. So that's what they're kind of back and forth. There's been a lot of testing and all of that. I don't think anything substantial has come out of it yet, but that's what they are working on. The Wernicke syndrome, or the Wernicke encephalopathy. Korsakoff is its own syndrome, but there's also a syndrome, like I said, Wernicke syndrome. These often go hand in hand, so much so that another name for Korsakoff syndrome is Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. A Wernicke episode will come first. It'll be a patient will have that, and it's an encephalopathy that causes damage to the lower levels of the brain, particularly the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And so that's the initial Wernicke encephalopathy. And what that looks like is you're going to see confusion, increased confusion in a patient. There can be enough brain damage that it actually leads to possible coma, and from there it can actually lead to death. You also see vision changes, double vision, rapid eye movement, you've even got like droopy eyes, like a lot of just not normal things happening with the eyes. There's also a lack of muscle coordination. Particularly, this usually presents most often in the form of a leg tremor. Your leg will start shaking. So those are the signs of the Wernicke. The Wernicke comes first, and like I said, in Korsakoff syndrome is kind of what follows as the Wernicke symptoms start to go away or start to kind of step back. Then you start seeing the Korsakoff syndrome symptoms picking up and it kind of going on. One does not cause the other, or Wernicke does not cause Korsakoff syndrome. You can have one and not have the other, though it is highly common to have both. And so that's something you see with this one is a lot of people who end up diagnosed with the Korsakoff syndrome had a Wernicke incident before their kind of thing. So like I said, these go hand in hand when affecting the brain in patients. Treatment for Korsakoff syndrome. Because Korsakoff syndrome is characterized by the lack of thiamine, the first and most common treatment way is to replenish the thiamine in the brain. If you replenish it, then the brain can start creating the energy again, and it can start functioning more on a normal level, and that'll hopefully reverse any of the brain damage that has happened. To administer the thiamine, it's done daily over an extended period of time. The extended period of time, it really depends on the patient. There's not like a set, like this many days for this effect. It really depends on when you caught it and the extent to which the brain is damaged. Those are the factors that kind of dictate how long someone's taking the thiamine injections. The injections you're injected intravenously because there's something about the abdomen. You can't be injected in the abdomen because there's something about the way the abdomen deals with contaminants or things introduced in its system that it would just be absorbed and taken care of there, and it would never get to the brain. So it's kind of pointless to do it that way. With treatment of Korsakoff syndrome, timing is key. You want to start the treatment as soon as possible. This kind of leads to, with recovery, it's important to start it as soon as possible to kind of negate those brain issues and keep them from growing. Other like smaller aspects of treating it is, especially if the patient is an alcoholic, it's lowering the amount of alcohol they're drinking because that's what caused it in the first place. So if you lower it, then the thiamine being introduced in the system isn't just immediately deplenished. Also, because malnutrition can cause it and can also play a factor in it, a lot of times dietary changes come along with this treatment. So a lot of times there's a list of like dietary changes from a doctor as to what can help treating, lessening certain foods, cutting out certain foods. This is all it depends specifically on the patient because it's all on the patient history and like kind of what areas they're not malnourished or how much they're drinking. So it's a very like case-by-case basis, but those can help with the treatment because if you're lowering the cause, then the thiamine will flourish more than if it's having to fight off being increasingly decreased. Recovery from the syndrome, like I said, recovery, again, it varies case to case. there are cases where a person can become completely recovered. These are usually the ones where you catch it soon and you start the thiamine replenishing almost immediately. Others can get away from this with just minor brain damage, just a little deficit here or there, but nothing that impedes them from kind of living their daily life. So that's a case, but because of what it is, it can cause lasting brain damage. There can be lasting memory issues, so much so that the person can't function. What kind of dictates how each person responds is going to be the person itself, but also when the treatment was administered. Like I said, the sooner you catch it, the better. You have a better chance of combating the brain damage if it hasn't been around that long, and also stopping it from spreading. And another factor is the severity of the brain damage itself. When you find it, how vast are the issues in the memory, how apparent is the loss of coordination, how it depends on the severity as to how well you can treat it. And again, these are things that just vary from a case by case basis. With Korsakoff syndrome, what comes next? So like I said earlier, researchers are still trying to figure out about this syndrome. It's relatively unknown. It's only been known for a little while, but that's because it's been around. It just kept getting misdiagnosed as things like Alzheimer's or dementia, things where it does look like that, but it's a new thing, and the treatments are going to be different. So researchers are still looking into the memory effects, and they're testing the episodic memory, they're testing encoding, they're looking at that and seeing how people react to different things with it, how vast is the memory impairment that comes from this, what does the memory impairment look like. They're also learning, they're testing the patient's ability after they've had the treatment, how well can they relearn tasks that they may have forgotten, and just how does the recovery kind of affect what they can learn more. So they're very much into testing and figuring out the nuances of this syndrome. They haven't identified a complete age gap yet, but that's because they're, like I said, still working and still trying to identify what outside of heavy drinking and the things that I mentioned before cause this to give this group is at risk. So they're still figuring that out. There's still a lot to be learned about this. There's a lot to kind of keep going, but they are on the right tracks of learning these and working forward with this. So that is Korsakoff syndrome. And here are all of my references that I used in the presentation. Thank you.